Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Ashton. I'm the Director of Communications for the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. And on behalf of our entire board and staff, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us for a conversation about the supplemental manatee feeding in the Indian River Lagoon, which the foundation is helping to fund. A couple quick housekeeping items before we get started today. Could you please double check to make sure that you're muted and you remain muted throughout the duration of our conversation? Exception is during the question and answer portion at the end, in which there's two ways to participate. You can use the raise your hand feature. I'll ask you to unmute and you can speak directly to our presenters, or you can drop your question in the chat and I can ask it for you, which is really helpful if you have a question that pops up during the presentation. You want to make sure you don't forget it. I'm really excited to be able to welcome back FWC's Imperiled Species Management Section Leader, Ron Mezek, and FWC's Manatee Management Program Coordinator, Michelle Pasowitz. Michelle, I'm going to send it over to you.
All right. I apologize about that. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Michelle, for the introduction. So happy to be here today. Just give me one moment. I will go ahead and share my presentation. All right. It looks like it's working. Michelle, can you just give me a thumbs up if you see it? All right. Great. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you again for that introduction, Michelle. I'm really happy to be here today to talk to everyone about Florida manatees and the ongoing unusual mortality event. But before we begin, just want to reintroduce myself. I'm Michelle Pasowitz. I'm with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I'm with the Imperiled Species Management Section located in Tallahassee. And I've been the Manatee Management Program Coordinator for the last 3 years, but I've been working with FWC on manatee management conservation issues for over 6 years now. I'll let Ron Mezek introduce himself further when it's his turn to present, but I just wanted to let you know that we also have Ron Mezek here. He'll be following my presentation towards the end, and he is the section leader for Imperiled Species Management. So for those of you that might not be entirely familiar with our agency, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, or the FWC, is the state agency responsible for the management of the Florida manatee. It's an iconic species. The Florida manatee is beloved by many Florida residents and visitors to Florida, and also by our agency. And it is so important to our agency and to the public. So we've fully dedicated our program to all things manatee. This includes things such as manatee rescue, manatee research, and the overall management of the population. We also implement critical protection measures that we have had in place for several decades and are still in place today. And last year when we met on this portal with the foundation, we did talk quite a bit about manatee biology, some of their threats, and the ongoing management and research efforts that our agency is involved in. So today I'm just going to give you a brief highlight on a few of those key points before we start talking about the event and the supplemental feeding trial. So Florida manatees are very dependent on suitable habitat here in Florida, and this includes both the temperature of the water around them as well as available food sources. And while we think of manatees as round in fat, they actually have less true blubber than most marine mammals, such as their close cousins, the seals and the walruses. And also because they eat a low energy diet of plants, their metabolism is not high enough for them to generate enough body heat to keep them warm when the water temperatures drop. So in Florida, when water temperatures such as the coastal estuaries, the Atlantic and the Gulf, and even some of our inland waters start to drop below that 60-degree Fahrenheit threshold, manatees will look for warm water sites, both inland and on the coast, and they'll often stay at these locations for the duration of the winter season. A dependable source of warm water for manatees is critical to the survival of the species and survival of the individuals that utilize it. Unfortunately, like everything else, there are short-term and long-term threats to warm water in the state of Florida and for manatees, and we continue to monitor that closely. Another important habitat consideration for manatees is forage. Manatees are both opportunistic and generalist herbivores, which is where they get their name, the sea cow. They can spend up to 8 hours per day grazing on all types of submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV for short. And a healthy manatee in the wild will eat anywhere from 4 to 9% of their body weight per day on most days. So submerged aquatic vegetation includes both seagrasses found in salt or estuarine environments, as well as freshwater aquatic vegetation. And both of these grow throughout Florida's waterways. SAV also plays a really critical role in the marine ecosystem as well as in Florida's economy. It helps to stabilize sediment, it provides food and habitat for marine organisms, and it maintains really good water quality. Some of the freshwater plants that manatees do enjoy include eelgrass and coontail, as well as some exotic species such as water hyacinth and hydrilla. And of the seagrasses found in Florida, manatees enjoy shoalgrass, turtlegrass, and many others. Unfortunately, similar to manatees, there are a lot of threats to SAV or to their forage types. There are direct impacts as well as indirect impacts to the SAV, and a lot of that, unfortunately, is due to human use of the ecosystems and of the uplands. Some of the direct impacts that we see to SAV includes dredging of Florida's waterways, excessive nutrient runoff from the upland sources, shading from things such as docks and overwater structures, and increased sediments from shoreline construction. Additionally, a direct impact that we see to SAV is something that we call prop scarring, which is when propeller boats ride through a shallow seagrass bed and actually directly impact or harm that seagrass from their props. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I should say, there are many conservationists and agencies and partners alike that care a lot about SAV and submerged aquatic vegetation species. So we all work together to practice conservation measures, habitat restoration, and work closely to monitor the SAV and the seagrasses found in Florida. Something that the public can do while they're here in Florida is practice smart boating by following marked channels and avoiding navigating through shallow grass beds, and then also by contributing to or not contributing to excessive nutrient runoff by being careful when applying fertilizers and pesticides in upland areas near the water. In order for our agency to offset these threats to manatees and to their habitats, we work to develop protection measures and minimization measures to prevent take of the species. The Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act, which is a chapter in Florida statutes, allows us to implement certain regulations to protect them from direct and indirect threats. But it's really important to highlight that the statute also directs us to use the best available scientific information when making our management decisions. So we work really closely with our research partners, both internal and external to the agency, to make sure that we have all of this information available to us and the latest and greatest to help direct our efforts. While some of our management actions do specifically apply rule or regulation to Florida and Florida waterway users, just about every activity that we engage in also involves a lot of education and outreach to ensure that the public is fully aware of why we take certain actions and things that they can do to help contribute to the conservation of the species. Which is why we are really happy to be here today. Just another opportunity to reach out to everyone who's concerned about the Florida manatee or interested in what's going on with the Florida manatee. And we're here today to talk about the Atlantic Coast Manatee Unusual Mortality Event, as well as some of the actions that both the FWC and our participating partners are engaged in to overcome this event. A quick history for those that might not be familiar. In December of 2020, our biologists, specifically on the Atlantic coast of Florida, did notice an uptick in both manatee mortality as well as manatees in distress in this region. So our agency, the FWC, as well as our federal partner, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we work together to investigate why we're seeing this unusual increase in deceased manatees and ultimately determined that the manatees were unfortunately dying from a lack of sufficient natural vegetation in their waterways within the Indian River Lagoon. The Indian River Lagoon, or IRL for short, has historically provided manatees with a habitat full of lush seagrass beds, and the grasses that were here in this ecosystem were enough to sustain manatees that spent a lot of time in this location for many, many years. But unfortunately, there has been a long-term decline in this available food source, specifically in the IRL region. We've been monitoring it closely, but there has been long-lasting phytoplankton blooms in the IRL starting in 2011. And these blooms have resulted in a significant impact to the sun-loving vegetation that is below. So the seagrasses, just like the grass on your lawn, they do require sunlight to grow and to flourish. And the phytoplankton blooms were restricting them from that ability to photosynthesize. And as I mentioned earlier, seagrass in its natural environment does help to maintain clear water quality. And so we found ourselves in this repeat cycle of negative impacts to the Indian River Lagoon, where the grasses were unable to grow and the water quality continued to be compromised. In the past couple of winters, we did reach a point in the IRL where there was very, very limited to none at all seagrasses, including macroalgae in the IRL. And unfortunately, the manatees did not have a sustainable food source in this area. And that is where we are today, working to respond to the unusual mortality event and working to help the manatees who don't have this available food source. And this unusual mortality event, or UME as you might hear it referred to, is certainly one of the largest and most challenging UMEs that our agency has been faced with. And while the FWC does have a well-established manatee response program, and we've navigated through the challenges of UMEs in the past, this one does require a large team and an all hands on deck type of response. So we've worked with many partners, both in the private industry, public, state agencies, and federal agencies. And we've come together to better understand and respond to this UME and try to figure out what exactly is happening in the Atlantic region. Shortly after the UME was declared in the late winter, early spring of 2021, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission developed a Joint Incident Command System, or structure, also known as an ICS. Many of you might have heard of an ICS in the past. This is a structured system, a structured hierarchy that many agencies implement when there are catastrophic events such as wildfires, hurricanes, and oil spills. And this is a tool, a very valuable tool that we've implemented to help us respond to this event. And it brings in additional partners, resources, and a bit of additional organization so that we can reach out to all of our available resources and use them appropriately. And since the ICS has been in place, we have been able to improve on our public information sharing and messaging. Just like serving on panels like this, we're able to make sure that the public has all of the information that they need. We maintain an updated web page, and we engage closely with our media personnel so that we can make sure that everyone is receiving the most up-to-date information. The ICS has also helped us to improve our coordination with the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership. And this partnership has been in place for a while, and it includes representatives from the state and federal agencies, as well as all of the rehabilitation facilities within Florida and outside of Florida. But we've really worked to improve that coordination and communication, as well as providing the MRP some additional funding to help us with manatees in need. Additionally, the ICS has helped us improve carcass recovery and disposal techniques. We've become more efficient in this field and have worked really hard to make sure that we are able to recover as many carcasses in the affected region as possible, as well as dispose of them appropriately if we weren't using them for necropsy. So A necropsy is an animal autopsy, and that helps us provide really, really important information to our investigation team. The team that's put together to fully understand the cause of this unusual mortality event, the effects of the event, as well as any potential future outcomes of the event. Additionally, we've improved our monitoring and tracking of manatees in the area. So working closely with our research partners who have satellite telemetry tags on manatees and those that conduct aerial surveys, we're able to investigate and fully study the movements of the manatees within this region and some of their individual behaviors as well. And of course, we can't forget the issue at hand, which is the decline in seagrasses within the IRL and poor water quality. So one of the other large components to our agency response is habitat restoration. The FWC, the Foundation, and many others have come together to expand on and enhance our restoration efforts, both within the IRL and in other areas of Florida. And Ron will be touching a little bit more on habitat restoration efforts when he is up. So while habitat restoration is a really important tool and will help us address some of the long-term concerns here, the agencies did understand that this is not a quick fix and something else needs to be done to help the manatees during this time. Last spring, in spring of 2021, we began assessing different actions to respond to the ongoing event, and we explored the idea of supplemental feeding. Now, supplemental feeding is not a typical wildlife management tool, and it's rarely used, and it's never been used for manatees before. So it was there were a lot of uncertainties and unknowns as we started exploring this option. One of the big questions that we had up front when we determined that supplemental feeding was a potential was the question of, should we feed manatees? Should we provide provisioning or supplemental food to the wild manatees? And this question right here was not one that we could answer within the agency. So we worked through our experts and hosted a meeting to solicit information, feedback, professional opinions, and data to help us answer this question. Some of the panelists in this meeting included manatee health experts, behavior experts, as well as those that are involved in habitat and the environmental concerns in Florida. We wanted to consider all of these different aspects to this question so that we could make sure we had the best information available and could make the best decision. There's several other thoughts that came up during this expert elicitation is that if supplemental feeding were to be explored, it was certainly agreed upon that the effort should be considered targeted, meaning both small scale and short term. Supplemental feeding is not a permanent solution, it's not a long-term solution, and so we had to make sure that we were going into it with those guiding principles and bounds so that we knew that our outcomes and any impacts from the effort were minimal. Some of those guiding principles that we went into the supplemental feeding program with included aiming to minimize the number of manatees in need of rescue, as well as the overall mortality associated with the event. We also aimed to minimize adverse or negative impacts and changes to manatee behavior associated with the effort. And lastly, we knew that we wanted to do no further harm to the environment as a result of our effort. So we had that as some point of guidance while we were exploring the options. And while we were working through that, we were trying to execute a plan, but we had a lot of other questions. As I said before, this is the first time that supplemental feeding has taken place for manatees. And so we had to work from the very beginning in planning those logistics, such as the what, the where, and the how. So what? What do we feed manatees during a supplemental feeding trial? Again, we consulted with many experts during this question. We received a lot of valuable input from manatee health experts, veterinarians, nutritionists, and those involved in manatee husbandry or in the rehab facilities. And we asked all of these questions. We explored all of the different types of food types that manatees eat in the wild and others that are offered to them in rehabilitation settings. We looked at the pros and cons of both native vegetation, invasive vegetation, as well as commercial produce. And where we determined was the most appropriate direction to go was offering manatees commercial produce, such as leafy greens like romaine and butterleaf lettuce, during the supplemental feeding trial, as it was agreed upon by our experts in those fields that this was an adequate source of nutrition and hydration, and it's what they feed manatees in the rehab setting as well. Additionally, we felt that leafy greens and commercial produce would have the least negative impact on the environment when we provide that within the wild ecosystem. So where do we make a supplemental feeding program take place, and where can we be successful? So the general area targeted for the supplemental feeding trial was within the northern Indian River Lagoon within Brevard County. This is where we saw the highest concentration of manatee carcasses the past 2 winters, and this is where we know that there was the least amount of natural forage available for manatees. Cape Canaveral Energy Center, or CCEC, was chosen as the best site for this effort due to its proximity to a large and reliable source of warm water where we expected to see a lot of manatees return the upcoming winter. And the area directly south of the warm water discharge was an area that's familiar to manatees as it once served as an interim warm water refuge during CCEC repowering. And after several site visits and meetings and planning, we opted to explore this option further, and it deemed a really, really good location for us to attempt the first year of the supplemental feeding trial. One of the logistical benefits to establishing the feeding trial at CCEC was the ability to secure the site from land-based access. We were storing equipment, we have rotating staff throughout the week, and security remained a big consideration. However, we also wanted to explore options for securing the site for protections from the water, and not only for our staff, but of course, and most importantly, the safety of the manatees using the area. Last winter, we were able to establish a temporary emergency rule. It's a no entry zone around the CCEC intake canal. And because this was temporary in nature, it only lasted 90 days, but was sufficient for the time period that we were at the site last year. We have since worked within our rulemaking authorities to develop a permanent seasonal no entry zone at the temporary field response station. And our intent for this zone is that it will not only provide protections for manatees utilizing the area for the supplemental feeding trial, but also into the future when this area serves as a warm water refuge for manatees. As many of you know, it's really important to protect manatees in these warm water sites, as any disturbance to them by boats or by people could potentially cause them to leave the area and expose them to cold water temperatures. So last winter, both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the FWC, our staff provided supplemental food to manatees at the site from January 20th through March 31st. And during this time frame, we provided mixed produce that included romaine, butterleaf, and cabbage, with romaine being the primary source of food. On average, we provided anywhere from 2,300 to 6,000 pounds per day, with the average being in that 2,500 range. And that amount of food that we provided each day did increase as the season went on and as more manatees visited the site. Last year, we also had to work within our power to increase our refrigeration capacity on site so that we could have food available for those daily loads. And we were able to improve on that as the winter went on. And so since the start of the trial last year, we acquired 202,000 pounds of mixed produce, with, again, the majority being romaine and butterleaf lettuce. Just over 200,000 pounds of that was provided to and presumably consumed by the manatees at the temporary field response station. As for funds spent on this produce, we were invoiced a total of £116,000, or $16,000, excuse me, and all but $200 of that total there shown on the screen was paid for by public donations to the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. And we're very grateful for the ability to be able to purchase that. That was a significant expense that we didn't expect going into the winter. And again, we couldn't have done it with everyone else who has worked with the foundation and has donated to this effort. And looking back on the winter, we unfortunately don't have a good way to quantify how much food was provided to each manatee on each day, but we are able to report on the averages, and we believe that approximately 37 pounds of food was provided to each manatee each day throughout the winter season, with some of those days being a little less and some of those days being a little more, depending on how many manatees were there. So it's not an ideal, there's a lot of caveats to that number, but it is our best understanding of effectiveness and outcome of last winter. And that brings us to this winter, so winter 2022-23. That's where we are today. We learned a lot last year and we're only looking to improve. After last winter's trial concluded at the end of March, we went right to work discussing all of the ways that we could increase the trial, improve the trial, and make it more effective for manatees. We went back and met with our experts again, those in the field of manatee health and behavior and habitat, and we asked them all of the same questions. We showed them exactly what we did throughout the winter, and we got a lot of really good feedback on how we can improve. And one of those things that we did to improve was started the supplemental feeding trial of year 2 a little bit earlier. While we mobilized essentially on the same day last year, this year we were lucky to see that the manatees were at the site and willing to accept the food much earlier. So we started the temporary field response station supplemental feeding efforts on December 16th of 2022, and we've been in full operation ever since. One of our other goals for this winter was to increase the total amount of food that was available for the manatees throughout the entire duration of the winter. So in order to accomplish that, we worked with the foundation several months before the event and made sure that we were communicating with our produce vendors and other partners alike, preparing them for our needs and making sure that we would have everything that we needed available. We also really increased our fridge capacity. This is essential for making sure that we can get large produce orders. And with that, we're also able to increase our daily food targets and ultimately provide more food to the manatees each day. So since December 16th, when we've started, we've provided over 66,000 pounds of lettuce to the manatees. And compared to last year, we're already significantly increasing the daily food amounts, as well as what we anticipate to feed throughout the entire season. So to date, we've given only romaine lettuce, but anticipate incorporating both butterleaf and greenleaf and potentially cabbage into this as well. And so far at the site, the number of manatees has ranged anywhere from 10 to 250 on any given day, and this is just in the feeding area. We've had counts of 1,000 or more up at the discharge area north of the feeding area. And we're closely monitoring these manatees at the site, and we're happy to report that all of the manatees appear to be accepting the lettuce that's provided to them. As expected, because we are in the winter season, we are seeing some manatees with signs of cold stress, and we are seeing a few manatees that might be slightly underweight, but we're watching them closely, and overall, the conditions of these manatees this year are pretty promising. Thinking back on our guiding principles again, as a reminder, one of them was to ensure that we are minimizing impacts to manatee behavior in response to this event. So we want to make sure that the manatees are not becoming dependent on this short-term effort, and we want to avoid any chance of the manatees associating people with food. So both last winter and this winter, we've implemented specific protocol to ensure that the manatees do not become habituated to us. And this includes installing visual barriers and limiting our time in the feeding area so that we are minimizing the signs of human presence. And it's also important that the manatees are provided the food in a safe manner, as we do not want to further disturb them in their resting areas. So we sought some expert advice from our manatee rehab folks and those that are involved in manatee husbandry. And they helped us develop some techniques to ensure that the food is being spread out within the feeding area as quickly and as evenly as possible to ensure that every manatee gets the opportunity to engage in the supplemental feeding area. In addition to just providing the supplemental food to manatees, we're also making sure that our monitoring efforts are continuing and improving compared to last year. We want to keep track of how many manatees are visiting the site, what their apparent health looks like, as well as any behavior. So we are surveying the manatees within the area and outside of the area several times per day. We're quantifying how many manatees are there so that we can adjust how much produce is going out on any given day. And we're taking note of any noticeable health concerns or behavior concerns and working closely with our rescue partners and staff to make sure that we're reporting any signs of distress so that those animals can be closely watched. We're also taking environmental temperatures and attributes at the site. So this includes ambient temperature, water temperature, and just the general forecast. As we learned last year, that the weather really does have a big influence on how the manatees respond to the area and their movements back and forth between other areas of the IRL, the discharge location where the warm water is, as well as the feeding location. And additionally, we're also keeping a close eye on manatees by collecting trail camera images and working with our partners to monitor the movements of those manatees that have satellite telemetry tags. It's really interesting information to learn of individual movements, and it teaches us a lot about how the manatees are reacting in this area. Both last winter and this winter, we're also partnering and grateful for Florida Power and Light, or FPL, and they're helping us to conduct periodic drone surveys of the feeding area as well as the warm water discharge. This information is helpful to help us document the animals that can't be observed from land and gives us that big picture observation of what the manatees are doing on any given day. So the drone surveys, in addition to regional aerial surveys, this information has been incorporated into our daily monitoring, and we're tracking that really closely. And lastly, we're also continuing water quality monitoring at the site this year. Last year, we conducted periodic sampling of the waters around the feeding area and in other areas of the IRL, as we wanted to ensure that our efforts were not contributing to poor water quality. So we're tracking for additional nutrients such as chlorophyll A and other types of nutrients that might contribute to algae blooms. And happy to report that from our information collected last year, our efforts did not contribute to any water quality concerns, and we'll keep a close eye on the information that we're collecting this year. So for the remainder of this winter, 2022-23, we'll continue to adapt as we did last year, and we'll improve the supplemental feeding trial based on our observations of manatee presence, their health, and behavior at the site. We do expect the number of manatees to fluctuate over the rest of the season over the next couple of months, and we'll continue to hope for a mild winter and hope that these animals find other natural sources of vegetation in the area. And while the objective of this trial is to provide supplemental food, we're prepared to potentially limit that if the manatees are naturally migrating to their spring and summer foraging grounds. And we'll keep a close eye on what those behaviors are telling us. We'll continue to be flexible and adapt everything that we do at the site for the best of the manatees. Between now and then, the end of March perhaps, we don't know exactly how much more food we'll provide. So that number could expand almost double to what we provided last year. And it is expected and we're prepared to provide more than 400,000 pounds. But again, we'll adapt our supplemental feeding trial accordingly, and we'll work with our powers and with the foundation to make sure that that food is available if the manatees are there. And And while this effort is really important on the short term, and we feel that there could have been a lot of positive outcome from last winter and from what we're doing this winter, it's certainly not a long-term solution, and there's so many other things to consider in the big picture of this unusual mortality event. And of course, the issue at hand, which is the health of the Indian River Lagoon. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron, and he will share his thoughts on some of the big picture and future efforts.
Good afternoon. I'm Ron Mezek. I am the section leader for FWC's Imperiled Species Management section, and I'm going to give you a brief update on some of the habitat projects we are working on that came through funding from the legislature 2 sessions ago, and then touch on a little bit about what we're looking at the rest of this winter and then beyond. So the habitat project status, remember that the funding we received was for improving access to warm water refuges for manatees, restoring forage areas where manatees are found, and we are using a multi-habitat approach to achieve those. Next slide, please. There we go. So planning and implementation. So when we started this 2 years ago, focus is the Indian River Lagoon, which is a 150-mile long water body ranging from Brevard County all the way down to Jupiter Inlet. So it's a pretty expansive area. The focus is in the Brevard County area, but we are looking a little bit beyond that as well. When we started this, we engaged with a number of partners and held a workshop because there are a lot of efforts already going on to restore habitat there, and we didn't want to be redundant. We wanted to make sure that any money we spent for restoration was additive. And so at that workshop, we had over 110 attendees. We specifically identified 16 projects that we discussed further, and then we've selected 7 priority projects to implement. And those are in different stages of implementation. I'm going to touch on about 4 separate projects that we are working on that I think will give you an idea of how we're using that multi-habitat approach. So the first one that's really important is the Seagrass Nursery Network. And we are partnering with the Indian River Lagoon, NEP, Florida Oceanographic Society, University of Central Florida on this effort. And what it is we're developing up to 7 locations for upland growing facilities for seagrass and freshwater vegetation. This is a potential large-scale operation that will allow us to plant large-scale operations. You can see the amount of money going into it. It's over $3 million when you take in all the sources of revenue that are being put towards this. And it's really important for 2 reasons. If you're not familiar with seagrass restoration, there are a couple of really important points to remember. Seagrass restoration is a difficult process, low level of success sometimes, unless you remember these 2 things. One is, if there's not seagrass growing somewhere, there's a reason why. And if you don't figure out what the reason is that's prohibiting it, you're not going to be successful. We know in the Indian River Lagoon, water clarity and water quality are some of those issues, and in many areas that is the issue, but there could be others, including sediment. So once you can identify areas and that the habitat is suitable for planting seagrass, the other thing to remember is that there are multiple ways to go about that. One is if there are seagrass beds close by, you can get natural vegetative reproduction into areas that are appropriate for seagrass growth. And sometimes we don't plant any seagrass because we'll know it come in on its own. But where we do plant, we usually use donor beds, which are nearby. And right now in the Indian River Lagoon, there are no donor beds. And so that's why these upland facilities are so important. They will be our donor beds when we get started. And not just for the lagoon, we are looking at a number of other areas that these will be sourced for seagrass shoots and freshwater vegetation as we move forward. So very important project. again, with the multi-habitat approach, the Indian River Clam and Seagrass Restoration Project is a great example. One reason why we're using clams and also oysters in association with seagrass plantings is because they are natural water filters. And it's not uncommon when you get around a oyster bar or where there are large clam beds that water clarity will be much better than some of the surrounding areas. And that's because they're such good filter feeders and great at clearing up water just by filtering it out through their filtration systems. That helps seagrass growth, and that's why you often find seagrass near clam beds and oyster bars. And so this is a large project, $2 million going to enhancing these native clam beds, and we think that will help seagrass growth, and in the end, it may even provide a resource for local communities if those clam beds are successful in the long run. Next slide. So warm water habitat projects, very important to manatees, as Michelle explained earlier in her presentation. We have 2 ongoing projects dedicated to warm water habitat. Warm Minnow Springs is on the southwest coast. It is the largest natural warm water site in southwest Florida, and it's needed some work due to sedimentation of the spring run. There are some trees and other things that have fallen in and created blocks for manatees accessing this area. And so a lot of work going in to improve that warm water habitat and make room for more manatees to get in there. This project kicked off this past summer. It is a little bit further than halfway done. The storm did provide some complications. We'll have to go back and do a little bit of work to get back to where we were, but there weren't significant impacts, which was good. We suspect this project will be completed this next summer. Next slide. And then a project that, multiple projects that are being organized and coordinated through the Florida Fish and Wildlife Foundation and partnering with Sea and Shoreline and FWC are a number of tributary vegetation planting sites. And you'll see these on the map on this slide, ranging all the way down to the Loxahatchee River, north to Brevard County, in the Titusville area. And these projects target tributaries into the Indian River Lagoon system. And it's important to remember that these tributaries, such as Turkey Creek, Goat Creek, Crane Creek, North Fork of the St. Lucie River, are all areas that manatees can access, have accessed historically, not only for freshwater, but for freshwater vegetation. And so the plantings going into these sites are Vallisneria, which is freshwater eelgrass that has a little bit of salt tolerance, but not a lot. So you find it in that freshwater area and then into where that tributary starts to get a little bit saline. It will grow there as well, but eventually it will fall out. Rupia is the second vegetation being planted in these sites. And Rupia is great because it has a very wide range of salinity tolerance, everywhere from complete freshwater to complete saltwater. And so that vegetation can expand beyond where Vallisneria can. And both are preferred manatee foods, so that's great. These projects were informed by a project we did in the Loxahatchee River where we planted 40,000 Vallisneria shoots into that tributary, and that told us a lot about how we can succeed in these other ones. And you'll notice that I mentioned exclosures in this first bullet. We do put exclosures over some of the planting sites. That is to prohibit foraging from not only manatees, but freshwater turtles, marine turtles, pinfish. There are a number of other foragers on plants in those systems that maybe aren't widely known, but we have seen do significant damage at times to plantings. And so protecting some of those plantings with barriers for a limited amount of time to allow them to get rooted and growing just helps these projects succeed in the long run. All right, next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about what's coming these next few months and then beyond. Michelle has touched on a little bit of this, and I'm going to go just a little bit further with both habitat and manatees. Next slide, please. All right, so habitat. I mentioned that, we're doing a multi-habitat approach, and we are working with a wide variety of partners, both state and federal agencies, and then NGOs, the foundation, private entities like Sea and Shoreline, which does a lot of restoration work. All of these are partners that we hope and are already working with in many cases to restore seagrass and freshwater vegetation. Again, working on water quality, not only seagrass direct restoration, but then using those multi-habitat approaches through clams, oysters. Salt marsh is oftentimes overlooked, but that is a very important shoreline stabilizer for seagrass beds, but also as a forage for manatees. And in that upper right-hand picture, you will see two manatees foraging on a salt marsh cordgrass planting area in New Smyrna Beach. And as we move further north in Florida and up into Georgia and South Carolina, that Spartina, or that salt marsh grass, is a primary food source for those animals. Statewide, we are looking at a wide variety of aquatic vegetation restoration. Seagrass in those marine areas, estuarine areas, but also freshwater vegetation statewide, and especially we're looking at projects in the St. Johns River right now for submerged aquatic vegetation to help restart some areas there. And then warm water habitat restoration is an ongoing effort for us, has been for a number of years and will be for a number of years moving forward as we look to secure warm water habitat throughout the state. Warm Mineral Springs and Blue Springs are two of the projects that we hope to wrap up this next summer, and then we will be expanding to new areas for that. Next slide. So manatees moving forward, I just wanted to touch base a little bit more. The UME is ongoing, and that is the designation for the unusual mortality event that is set up through federal agencies, NOAA, and in this case, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well. And that is to start the investigation to the cause of the unusual mortality event. That investigation may go beyond our response or may end before our response is finished. It all depends on the situation. I've seen it happen both ways. But in any case, the response, as Michelle mentioned earlier, is based on what we're seeing in the field. And so rescue and recovery is ongoing, and we manage that response to need. And so we've been doing rescue and recovery with our partners for a number of years. We enhanced that response for Indian River Lagoon when the UME started. And as it hopefully in the near future begins to settle down and become more normal, then we will, adjust accordingly. Supplemental feeding is very similar, as Michelle mentioned. It is based on health, behavior, and the environment, and we evaluate that each year. Some good news with a lot of cautionary principles along with that. As Michelle mentioned, we saw health of the animals appeared to be improved going into this winter. Those were observations being made in the field. And then in December, when we caught and tagged 9 manatees to follow through the winter, those animals all met all our typical health criteria for a healthy manatee, and that was a great sign. But with that caution, 9 animals is a very small sample size. As we moved into the animals coming to the feeding site, we've been able to look at more animals, and the observations are generally the animals look in pretty good shape, but there are those animals that are still showing up that are underweight and showing some effects from that UME event where some of them still aren't finding enough food. Some, again, good news, at least for now, environmentally. We have gotten reports in Mosquito Lagoon, which is immediately north of the Indian River Lagoon, that there have been some recovery of seagrass beds there this past spring and summer. And a number of animals took advantage of that. Our distribution surveys showed there were a large number of manatees working the lagoon this summer, and that's probably one reason why they're in better shape. The other is we think behavior for some animals, they've adapted. They've gone to other areas during the warm season and took advantage of food sources elsewhere and came back in better condition. So both of those are good signs. Again, a lot of caution. One large algae bloom One multiple week cold front could change that good news to taking a step backwards. So a lot of caution, but some optimism here as well that we wanted to share. And then those decisions that, we will review all of these again this summer, as we have the past 2 years, to determine how we go forward next winter. And we are, using the information from our monitoring to help inform us on that. So seagrass monitoring will be ongoing this spring and summer. We just got a little report from Water Management District that they found some additional seagrass beds in the northern Indian River, in the Mosquito Lagoon that we hadn't been monitoring in the past, that are there, and that's more good news, again, with a lot of caution. Water quality, the clarity of water has been great in a number of areas in the lagoon and Mosquito Lagoon for the last year, and that's important to seagrass growth, so that's a little bit more good news. And then manatee distribution, we continue to do monthly surveys during the winter, and we'll do some more during the summer to keep tabs on where the animals are, and that will help us, again, inform our approach and response next coming winter. So with that, I think Michelle and I are ready for questions.
Great, thank you, Ron. We're having some great questions come in. We're going to start with Bill, who asked, can the use or the overuse of herbicides contribute to the loss of vegetation that manatees feed on?
I would say we have not seen that occur in many areas where manatees are present. The lagoon, change in lagoon habitat is pretty well documented to a buildup of nutrients in the lagoon that fueled the algae blooms that then eliminated light penetrating the water column to seagrasses, and they require light to grow. And so that was the trigger in the Indian River Lagoon. In most other areas of the state that are monitored, seagrasses are doing well. And while there are some losses of seagrass in the St. Johns River, those seem to be attributed to multiple storms, high water events, and again, lack of sunlight getting to those vegetation sources.
Great, thank you, Ron. We had another question asking about how hurricanes impact manatees and their preservation. And I just wanted to say one of the plantings on the map that Ron shared that we're working on of the 9, our first one was in the Loxahatchee. And that site experienced 2 hurricanes this last year, and both neither managed to take out the planting. So I can report that as a test that our planting has survived in the Loxahatchee after 2 hurricanes.
So I can answer the vegetation part of that, and I'll let Michelle answer the manatee portion of hurricane impacts. So with vegetation, certainly storms can have an impact on vegetation in a couple of different ways. If through wave and rainfall, both of those can impact seagrasses. Rainfall, of course, brings in a lot of tannins from the uplands and can bring in nutrients, which can spur algae blooms or just darken the waters for long periods of time, which can affect growth of seagrasses. The good news from the hurricanes this year, at least to this point, didn't have long-lasting effects in the Indian River Lagoon, so that's a good sign. And we haven't seen any large uprooting of vegetation, as Michelle mentioned, on the seagrasses that are being monitored. But those effects have been documented in the past in other storms. So yes, and currently no.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we're very fortunate to see that the Indian River Lagoon water quality was not really impacted from these past hurricanes, but we did see some signs of impacts within the St. Johns River system reported by our partners and internal colleagues as well. Some of the native submerged aquatic vegetation was impacted by the recent hurricane, and we're also seeing an increase in exotic floating vegetation too, which is a contributor to the system. But yep, everyone is a little bit of a gamble. But as Ron mentioned, there are some direct impacts to manatees from hurricanes. They're not entirely all too common, but oftentimes with hurricanes, we see king tides, rising water levels in areas that manatees don't typically have access to on a regular tide cycle. So occasionally we will see that manatees find their way into areas over weirs or into retention ponds while that water is high, and then when that water recedes, they do become entrapped. So that has happened in the past, and our rescue folks keep a close eye on these areas after storms pass through and conduct rescues as necessary.
Thank you both. I am keeping an eye on our time because I want to be mindful that everyone's giving us a precious hour in the middle of their day. So we have a few more minutes for questions before we have to wrap up. We got a question from Julie asking about if people have been willing to reduce their fertilizer usage. I don't know, Ron or Michelle, if that's about out of the scope of your work, or if either of you want to address that question.
So it is a little bit out of our scope, but I can relay this, that a number of local governments do have restrictions on fertilizer use along the water bodies. I believe Brevard County is one of those now that is doing a lot of work, not only with fertilizers, but septic tanks and other contributors to nutrients into the water bodies there. So that's not an uncommon approach.
Thank you. Well, I shared 2 links in the chat for folks who are interested. Many of you have already donated to the feeding, and we're incredibly grateful. If you'd like to continue to support us so that we can help FWC buy lettuce, I shared the link for that. I also shared a link for giving us feedback on the conversation today. We'd love to hear from you about what we can improve, what you want us to talk about next time. If you have questions that come up that didn't get answered today, feel free to drop them in that survey or send it to me. You can find my email on our contact us page on our website, wildlifeflorida.org, or you can simply reply to the email that you received with the information with the Zoom information for today. That goes directly to me, and so I can pass on your questions that I can't answer to Ron and Michelle and get you some answers. Is there, Ron and Michelle, wanted to give you a chance to, if there's anything wrap up that we didn't cover, you want to make sure we talked about today?
I just wanted to highlight the URL that's on the screen right now, the long one that ends in /UME/. We're constantly updating this webpage with updates of the ongoing unusual mortality event, and this is related to supplemental feeding, rescues, recoveries. So I do encourage folks to bookmark this link and to visit it frequently for updates.
I guess I would pass along again, cautiously, a little bit more good news, and that is that mortality so far this winter in Brevard County and Atlantic Coast is much lower than it has been the last couple of years. So that's good. In fact, we've got more cold stress happening elsewhere in the state than we do where we are working right now. So we hate to see any of it, but cautiously hoping it stays a warm winter, but mortality is down for now, and that's a good thing.
Great. Well, I wanted to thank Ron and Michelle again for being generous with their time to talk with us today. It's great to be able to talk to you guys again. Really appreciated the update. And thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day to join us for this conversation, for your engaging with the topic, for your questions, for your donations. And again, if there's anything, any questions or concerns you have, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll help give them answered. And, just again, thank you, everyone.